scope of practice defines the limits.
Press overhead, try not to let your back arch.
I know when I first started TRX.
So maybe we cue out of that.
Previously with our overhead squat.
So we're looking to see at the feet, knees.
Hey everyone, and welcome to our Wednesday We Speak series. My name is Katrina Pilkington, and I will be your host today as we lead a discussion within our community about equity at work and equity in the wellness and fitness space. I know many of you know that diversity, equity, equality, and inclusion are a huge part of my heart and how we unify as a community to help our clients and students feel welcome and whole. So I'm here today with my friend and colleague, Ms. Dynasti Hunt. I will explain a little bit about her, and then also dive into some questions and discussion about equity in the wellness space. And if you guys have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We will try to address them at the end because who knows, we might actually answer them for you during our conversation. So just a little bit about Dynasti. She's the lead educator at Equity at Work and Equity in Fitness. Equity in Fitness is all about committing together to transform group fitness into a space where we are about equality and decision-making, elevating diverse perspectives, and we are committed to helping with inclusion for instructors to grow and thrive. I know a lot of you have heard me talk a lot about DEI work, and so for me, diversity means welcoming a variety of folks. Inclusion means ensuring that they belong, and I'm going to allow Ms. Dynasti to discuss what she feels equity means in this space. Welcome.
Thank you, Katrina. I'm so excited to be here and be talking about this subject that is near and dear to my heart, and really a lot of what my work has been about for my entire career. So you asked this question on what do we mean, or what do I think about when I think about equity? And I truly think about this not just in saying equity, but thinking about racial equity, and how do we make sure that it's not just about saying someone has a seat at a table, that they have a place in the discussion, but that they have equal voice. They are equally compensated for that voice, that they have equal decision-making rights, and the way that they are seen is truly equal. And I think a lot of times folks equate equality to equity, and they're definitely different because equality states that everyone is starting from the same place. Equity actually acknowledges and names that actually for people of color, particularly, or marginalized groups, that they are not starting at the same place, that they are starting like 5 sets behind. So in order for there to be equitable systems, we first have to get to a place where equity, everyone is meeting the same place, is happening at the same time.
Right. It's just important for folks to understand that's what we mean, that equality and equity keep getting interlaced with each other, and they're very different. And in our industry, we are championed with not just being trainers and instructors, we are also coaches and mentors and business owners. So can you give a little background of how you got into this work and kind of how it integrated with fitness?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting story. I actually started off doing this work in the corporate side of things, and still do this work on the corporate side of things, and started teaching as a group fitness instructor, and then became a personal trainer, got certified, and was like, I'm going to keep these two worlds separate. So I will do equity work when I'm at work, and then at my other work, which is fitness, I'm just going to come in and teach classes and not really dig into that side of what I saw happening. But as I continued to deep dive further and further into the industry, started training other instructors, started digging into more studios and their practices, I realized that my two worlds were quickly colliding, because what was happening was I was experiencing things from an inequity standpoint, but also observing clients who were experiencing the same, as well as other instructors, and really felt this need to call it out in this industry and to say, I can't just be someone who's going to teach the class or take the workout. If I'm really going to be committed, we have to address what's happening in the fitness side as well.
Right. Isn't that funny? Like Dynasti and I connected, I can't even remember how. Like all of this kind of, I guess you can say, exploded in March, April of this year, not just COVID, but racial injustice. And I personally come from a world of diversity, equity, and inclusion in my corporate experience. And again, like Dynasti said, I try to keep it separate. I'm a fitness educator. I'm going to keep that separate. And now is a time for us to bring everything together. For those of you watching that are kind of like, how is this working? It collides, particularly if you're in these experiences yourself, right?
Yeah, and there's something about, from a personal standpoint, I don't think folks understand enough what those experiences are like, and they don't hear those stories, and they're just now starting to hear those stories, unfortunately. You know, I have experienced by training instructors, there's a lot of instructors who are like, here's my story, here's what's happened to me, here's how I've experienced inequity as a Black instructor, as a Latina instructor, as an Indigenous instructor, an Asian. And those stories don't get told enough because so many individuals are scared to share. They're like, if I do that, then what does that mean? How will I be penalized? How will I be looked at differently? Will I be looked over for jobs? Will clients not want to work with me? So there's a little bit of fear in sharing their stories. I think what's been different is March was the catalyst of, for unfortunate reasons, but in some good ways, really shifting the conversation and getting instructors to share their different sides. I felt this responsibility to bring these things to light and to really push people, because I do this work in the corporate side of my life. And because fitness matters as much as me as the fitness side, I was like, it's going to be really hard for me to ignore the stories that I'm hearing, the things that I've experienced myself, and to pretend like it doesn't exist or that we're okay. Because a lot of times we're like, well, we're focused on everyone matters. All bodies matter in the fitness industry. And that's like, that's nice that you want to talk about inclusion. But if including means you give me a seat at the table, but it's not an equal seat, or I'm sitting 4 steps away from the table where everyone else is at the table, or you're not compensating me, you're not making sure that my voice is equally heard, well, then maybe I don't want to feel included, because that also does not mean that you truly have made me feel included. And I'm seeing just so much dialogue that's kind of pushing the direction of, let's not focus on equity. But the reality is, for organizations, particularly fitness studios, fitness associations, and everything under the sun, if you really want to become an anti-racist practice, which I'm hearing that term a lot right now, if you truly want to do that, then you are focused on the work of racial equity, and you're not just solely resting on diversity and inclusion, because inclusion says, let's make sure everyone feels like they somehow belong, but it doesn't mean that you're equal. And diversity is pretty much like, are you represented? But that does not mean that you're treated equally, even if you are represented.
Right. And I've talked about that. I think I did an Instagram post. I don't even remember what I post anymore. It's so organic. But I did a math equation where it's like diversity and inclusion don't equal equity. They all have to come together. And whenever I speak about this, I spoke about this at IDEA. I'll be talking about it at Optima as well. They all work together to ensure equality. They all come together to ensure that all humans, and this goes, and I'll allow you to speak on this more, Dynasti, this goes for not just the folks that you are training, the folks that you are teaching, and how you cue and how you speak. It's also your hiring practices, it's your marketing practices, it's your pricing, like it's every single little thing you do, right?
Yeah. So one of the things that strikes me, Katrina, as you were saying that, is it's about the marketing, the hiring. It's even about the coaching practices. So what a lot of people don't realize is they go in, and let's take a quick example, because I'm sure this person is okay if I share it. I won't name names, but they have a situation where at their studio, they were taught to coach and how to teach. And they would say certain words that were very much culturally core to who they were. And the studio then said, yeah, we understand that's culturally who you are, and they're not words whatsoever. It's a great phrase, we guess, but like, we want you to say it like this. Like, this is the way that our people say it. And they were the only instructor of color out of 10 people on this team. So to say, like, we want you to say it like everyone else says it. Oh, you want me to say it like someone who's white? Let's just be blunt and like name that's what it is. But what you're doing is you're taking away me and my culture, but you're also telling me that it's not okay to bring who I am. that's where
Right.
you start to get into equity. That's where you start to get in the heart of like what truly matters and what differences should be made when you're
Right.
having those conversations. So I 100% agree with you that I think a lot of times there's so much focus on the client and what the
Right.
client is experiencing, and that's important. But the reason why I even started Equity in Fitness was because of what is happening on the
Right.
hiring, marketing, on the actual staff side and what they're experiencing.
Right. Right. And that's what I try to explain to some comments I've gotten about this series that I speak about. And, you know, we are huge about science-based training and science-based group fitness instruction. I totally am there for that. But I also think about the fact that we are mentoring and molding business owners who are wanting to, you know, when you sit down and write a business plan, for example, I know you've done this as well, I looked at my demographic, but my demographic is not just sequestered to one pocket of people. And just because I speak a certain way doesn't mean that the instructors that would work with me would. So what do you feel, Dynasti, is, I guess you can say, the biggest issue that you see in the world of wellness right now in regards, I know you have to narrow it down, in regards to equity in the fitness space? Like, even if you could just generalize like 2 things that you see instructors or trainers doing or not doing in that space.
So there's so many. I know. It's like, can I just give you 2? I can give you like 17. I'll give you 2.
I know.
So the 2 I would name off the top of my head that I think are relevant right now. One is how we are treating our staff from a virtual experience. And what I mean by that is there are so many individuals that obviously had to go virtual given everything that's going on with COVID-19 and all that's happening with the pandemic. And the way in which instructors are being not in an equitable way, the way that they're being treated in terms of who gets classes, whose classes get marketed from a virtual perspective. And then when the studio goes from a process of we are virtual and now we're going to start to reopen, how they are choosing which instructors actually are teaching and get to come back and have compensation and be able to be back with clients is also a big issue that I think is being raised right now that needs to be addressed. I think the other thing that's coming up right now is, I say this because I think it's just, I'm a blunt person. I love to just say what it is. But I do think that because a lot of individuals have suddenly like seen what they haven't seen before. It's like, oh, in March, I didn't realize that in equitable practices that racism still exists in this country. And it's like, oh, it does. It never went away. You may not have, you've had the privilege of not having to experience it, but it has been here. But because everyone has gotten quote unquote woke to it, now everyone is like, let me run to my one Black instructor on the team and ask them all of the questions and tell them like, how do we change our systems and our practices and how do we do things differently? And you're putting a lot of burden on that individual and you're not compensating that individual to educate you on what to do differently. So just telling folks and reminding folks, there are consultants, there are folks like you and I and other people who can help them with that, who you can pay for that work. But remembering to not all of a sudden shift the tide so much so that now all of a sudden you've posted something on Instagram, you've put together a pledge, you're doing all this performative action, and now you're leaning on your 1 to 2 people of color to somehow or another save you from the scrutiny of what you should have been digging into in the first place. Like, let's not do that.
Right. And you and I talk about this, and I explain this to folks all the time when I actually work with brands, much like Dynasti does too, on the inside. And I say that I am representative of one voice of color. I do not represent every single Black voice. I do not represent every single voice of color. So all of us are different humans, but we each bring a different piece to the table. And some of us are skilled in some things where others are skilled in other things. And yes, it's very important to have representation for marginalized populations in-house. I think we'll talk about the steps to becoming more equitable. I think it's important to have that in-house, but just because somebody is of color doesn't mean, and I'm just gonna be honest too, I say that they're not Google, that it's important to read books. It's important to seek out DEI consultants like you and myself and others in this space to ask how to structurally debunk and shift the tide from the inside out, down, top to bottom, right?
That's exactly right, Katrina, because the reality is this work is personal. So it's not just I can change a system, right? So you can change a system. You can be like, did we make the system more equitable? Sure. But if you do not change your own internal mindsets and behaviors and shift yourself personally, then you could end up with the same inequitable systems and processes and the same non-anti-racist practices because you are operating with a lens that doesn't have equity. And so it's it's both. It can't be one or the other. I think some folks are like, well, let's just change the system or let's write a new policy. That's great. But if you don't address the inside, to your point, then who's who's at the top, who's applying it, then the same results will actually happen even if you change the system, because you haven't changed personally too. So it has to be that self-examination and the structural examination. They go hand in hand.
That's the number one thing I talk about is it starts with the heart. It starts with the person. So let's just say we have a studio and there's an owner or owners. Those owners have the responsibility, just like all of us do, to tackle internal implicit biases first and foremost. But I always explain to people that all of us have them, even those of us in marginalized groups. So it's just being in front of the curve, taking that implicit test, working with folks like yourself and myself to debunk what you're constantly thinking, unconsciously knowing you could be hiring in a certain way, or you could be speaking in a certain way in queuing and not even know that you're not necessarily discriminating out the gate, but you could be being inequitable just based on the way that you speak or think or run your business and not even know it.
It's interesting because so much in the wellness and fitness industry, we give these tips, right? We're like, okay, 30 minutes a day of exercise, 5 days a week, or just split it out. Or if you get 5 minutes, you should meditate for 5 minutes a day. And what I've been saying to folks is, have you done your self-examination meditation for today? Like, have you stopped? Have you stopped and started to ask yourself questions? Because it's an everyday thing that we have to do. Hey, when I said that, let me step back. Like, who did I harm by saying that? Who did I possibly benefit? Where did I get this belief from? Where does this core belief driven form? And is it something that is driving equity, or is it not driving equity? And if it's not, I've got to unpack that. But it's almost like this daily practice that folks have to do that I think it's really easy. I put up a post a couple of weeks ago and it said something related to, like, I'm seeing so many people commit to a wellness plan, but not commit to a daily, like, anti-racist plan. And I'm like, hey, it's an everyday. So even 5 minutes a day, this is what you need to do to work on it every single day. And that's all of us.
Right. Especially if you want to be that equitable person. And I think being defensive is typically the trigger, the reaction that most of us, even me included, can give, where we're like, I'm not this way, or I'm not inequitable. But when I take those implicit bias tests, which I can definitely post the link in the chat, and I will speak about this at Optima, I am surprised myself that I actually have bias towards certain groups that I think there's no way, but we don't know what's happening with all those synapses in your brain. So you can't think that you're a bad person. You can't think that you don't mean well, but you have to do the work constantly every single day. So how important, Dynasti, do you feel that, because going along with biases, I always talk about diversifying your personal close circle. How important do you feel that is for business owners or fitness professionals to do, to assess their bias, look around themselves, and think about their own circle being very diverse?
Yeah, I think that's a critical piece, but I think it's important for folks to do it without being tokenistic. So making sure that if you're diversifying your base and the people around you, that the diversification doesn't lead to, well, I'm just doing this because I need these different perspectives and I want to show base value that, like, look, I have a Black friend, I have an Asian friend, I have, I have an Indigenous colleague. So I've gotten it. I've got it figured out. It's like, no, that may be a step one, but you've got to do real digging so you can see different perspectives, hear different perspectives, and truly try to understand them. It is so fascinating to me, the amount of individuals that I've talked to in the last 6 months who had no idea that they were, behaving in ways that even their diversified friend base or their diversified colleague base would have said, like, oh, this is not something that I would uphold. And they've lost friends over it. And when they've talked to me, a couple of them that I've started to coach have said, well, why do you think that is? And I said, like, because you probably were doing it in a tokenistic way. It's helpful if you diversify your friend base, but it's not helpful. It's not fun when you have to get uncomfortable, when you have to dig into these further conversations. You have to learn something new. You have to push yourself out of a comfort zone. But guess what? This work is not meant to make you comfortable. If you're comfortable and you're doing this work, you're not doing the work. You're still
just like in fitness training.
You're still in pre-work. Oh, you're still reading the certification manual. Like, you haven't started teaching. Like, you remember that first day. I remember those first couple of weeks of teaching where I was like, why in the world did they hire
I
me?
know.
This is terrible. My timing is off. I don't
Yeah.
know how to, like, I went from like 9 to like 2 an account.
Right.
Terrible, right? But you get better over time.
Right.
It's the same thing. If you
Yep.
start to practice and you start to ask questions and start to have those real conversations with the people around you, you will learn more. You will get
Right.
better over time. You will
Right.
get it more and more. But so many folks don't even have that first conversation.
Yeah.
They are stuck in like, I took my certification test, I passed, but I never went and took my first
Right.
class. I never went and taught my first class, so I don't even know what to do. And I equate that to, oh, it's because you were stuck over here in pre-work land and you
Right.
actually did not do the work. And that's one
Right.
of the things that I preach so much. I'm like, do the work. And doing the work isn't the book or the certification or the thing that you listen to. That's all pre-work. But doing the
Right.
work are the hard conversations,
Yep.
are the hard
Hard
looks in the
truths.
mirror,
Yep.
and like receiving the hard truths, not
Yep.
being defensive about them, but
Lovingly.
receiving.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, wow. This is
Yeah.
what you're seeing. And even if I don't necessarily see that in me, there is something that you are seeing or experiencing that I now need to dissect,
Right.
period.
Having a trusting circle. And it's funny because when people get to know me and they look at my friend circle, they're like, whoa, because it's completely different perspectives, completely different individuals, colleagues, identities, but those that I would trust to give me feedback, to where if they gave me feedback, my responsibility is not to get defensive. It's to say, okay, this person loves me enough to sit in my seat empathetically and give me feedback to help me be better. And that's super important. But aside from that, Dynasti, what do you think when it comes, so we talked about like diversifying your circle, we talked about taking a look at biases. What do you think are some tangible things, as I will welcome people to ask questions if we have questions in the Facebook and Instagram Live, are some tangible things that instructors, trainers, anybody in this space can do to start looking at being more equitable in whatever capacity they work in?
Yeah, one of the things that I lead a lot of companies through is called an equity assessment or an equity audit, where you're stepping back to really examine your own company practices, your own structures. How do you teach? How do you get new clients? Your clients experience your class, really, like digging into what are the systems that you have in place, handbooks, all of those pieces, and really trying to get folks to examine what's happening there and what are the roots of where it originated from and how do you change it. If you can go into it and you can examine that, then you will have an actual plan for what to tackle and where to tackle first. Now, a couple of things. When you do that, you should do that with a diverse group of people. So if you're looking around and you're like, oh, I have an all white leadership team or my instructor base is all white. Yeah, you can't do an equity audit with everyone being and looking the same and coming from the same experience. So you may have to go out and pay for folks to come in and be a part of the audit and examine and help you examine. The other thing that I think is really important for folks to do is to really think about, as they think about their, not just hiring practice, but their retention practices, what are the things that need to look different? So many folks go immediately to, we need to hire. We need to hire a more diverse team and then we're good. But like I said before, like you can hire someone and they can feel tokenized because you aren't doing the other pieces of the work. So really examining and digging into how are we and how are people experiencing us from a culture standpoint, and what would make them leave and what would make them stay. I mean, one good question to ask, it's a hard question, but I think a lot of studios aren't wanting to ask it. But I'm like, if you ask it, you will get some real feedback, which is, would you recommend another diverse person, another person of color to come and work at the studio, to come and take class at the studio, and why or why not, and get specific on your responses? That question right there will give you a ton of feedback.
Even independent instructors, even if you're somebody who doesn't have a business, you are your business.
Right.
So to Dynasti's point, doing these practices, even with yourself, because especially when you're an independent business owner, I sometimes feel like you can be a little bit more biased, right? You can have just your thoughts, your actions, your hiring, your protocols, your teaching, everything's very aligned. And it can be very uncomfortable to come in and have to integrate different structural changes.
Because it's such an examination process, right? So you're truly solo owner, you're truly having to examine you, and that can be hard. So I also encourage people, if you're a solopreneur doing this on your own, do you need to do this work? 100%. But I would even encourage more so to find a consultant or a coach that can sit alongside you and do the work with you, because you need someone who is trained in this that can help you through this and help you unpack some of the things that are going to come up, because the reality is some of the roots that you may be dealing with go way back, and they're going to come up if you allow them to. But there is a way to unpack them in a way that then says, like, but what does this business? How do I move forward? And make sure that you move forward in a way that doesn't feel like, am I going to have to like shut this whole thing down and start from scratch? No, you don't. You can find pieces that you're going to prioritize to do over time. But the reality is, when you're doing it alone, it's a lot harder to see the forest from the trees. And so you need someone who can be your side-by-side coach, looking at it and going, this is what I see, and you can't see it, but I'm going to help you get through it so that you can move in a direction that you are learning. And as a result, your business is learning and having, receiving the impact from that. Because I think people miss that at the very end of the day, a more diverse business and more a business that is centered on equity means a more diverse client base. That means more for you and your business. And that means you're learning more, you're growing more in different ways. And I think a lot of times folks are just so stuck on fear of what will I lose? And I think on the other side, and the other side of loss is like, what will I gain? And if folks really start to ask themselves that and answer that question more so than they ask themselves the question of what will I lose, I think they will come to these conversations and come to this work with a very different mindset and ready to really dig in and do the work.
Right. And that's absolutely what I feel like when it comes to even my own business. I work online. And one of the things I've done personally to be more equitable is doing like free work for some populations, like children and families who cannot afford things, and access my services, which is something that business owners want to think about too. So our last point before we have to end our conversation that we could talk about forever was, I know I get a lot of questions about pricing. So how can that be more equitable in the whole sliding scale thing? To your point, people are so focused on profits and I have to hit this profit margin. But correct me if I'm wrong, I feel you reach more and you help more by offering more options, especially to those that may not be able to access, because fitness should not be something that's inaccessible.
Oh, this is a big one for me. So I completely agree with you in that if you can offer a larger sliding scale, it helps. And if you can be explicit about that. So if you can be transparent about what that sliding scale is and not behind the closed doors of, let me work out a deal with you, because in itself, by doing that, you actually create inequitable practices if you are not honest about your pricing up front.
Patronizing.
It's patronizing. The other thing is, this is me personally, but I really struggle with these plans where it's like, if you pay upfront today, then it's this price. But if you have to pay over a period of time, then it's this price that is like $1,000 more, $2,000 more. I really need folks to recognize the absolute inequity that comes from doing that immediately. And I know there's like, well, we want to give some incentive to pay people who pay upfront. But what you're also saying is people who cannot do it right now, that they need to be charged that much more.
Looking on the flip side of the coin.
Oh, goodness. Totally, and I mean, like, yes, this is about inequity, but also let's just talk about the fact that we are in the time of COVID-19, and trying to charge people in that way is just completely something that I think a lot of business owners need to go back and take a very deep look at.
Yeah. So I definitely want to make sure that all of you have Dynasty's contact information, which I will be putting in the Facebook page under comments. But if you want to tell them, Dynasty, how to find you on your website and your email and your Instagram.
Absolutely.
Before we end.
Yeah, so my website is dynastyhunt.com. My Instagram is Dynasti Hunt, and my email is dynasty@gmail.com. So super easy. Just look for Dynasty with an I. It's consistent because I wanted people to be able to find me. So
she knows I only call her Destiny because my daughter and I watch too much Finding Nemo, and sometimes I'm like, no, it's Dynasty with an I. So you say it a few times and you repetitiously remember, but just know that out there in the fitness world, everyone, that we are here to help and work together. And as Dynasti said, we sit shoulder to shoulder. There's no shame in hiring somebody to come in and help you make your business more humanitarian, more equitable, more diverse, and help with inclusion to help your audience belong versus just be sold to or trained or coached or taught. It's much more impactful than that. So thank you, Dynasti, for coming on with me today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And if anybody has questions, I will try to comment in the question box, and stay tuned and stay in touch with Dynasti as we talk more on this later at another time. Thank you.
Thank you.